So thank you everybody so much for coming to the Anti-War Action Network's first digital webinar. We're here to talk about pinkwashing, what it is, how it affects our movement, being in the anti-war movement here in the US. And we're going to hear from some awesome speakers from all over the country. My name is Ryan. I use they, them pronouns, and I am a member of the Anti-War Action Network Steering Committee. I'm also the chair of communications for the Jacksonville Palestine Solidarity Network. Joining us as speakers today, we have Lana, who uses she, they pronouns. Lana is the chair of the Green Bay Anti-War Committee and is also involved with the Wisconsin Coalition for Justice in Palestine. Skyler, whose pronouns are they, them, is a member of the Minneapolis Anti-War Committee, which is leading the fight for the state of Minnesota to divest from apartheid Israel. They are also a member of Ask Me 3800 and has their pension invested by the Minneapolis State Board of Investment. Skyler plays a key role connecting the labor and anti-war movements in Minneapolis and St. Paul. We also have Sara, who uses she, they pronouns. Sara is the chair and founder of Jacksonville Palestine Solidarity Network. She's also a former national member of the Palestinian Youth Movement and is herself a queer Palestinian whose family is from Tukuram. And last but not least, we have Elle, whose pronouns are they, them. Elle is a member of the Dallas-Fort Worth Anti-War Committee and a lead organizer with Jewish Voice for Peace in Dallas-Fort Worth. So we're going to be hearing from all these excellent speakers today and going over a number of prepared topics. I will ask that if anybody has any questions that they would like to ask the speakers, we will have a Q&A section at the end. So feel free to put those questions in the chat, and we will select a few of them that based on what we have time for to answer at the end. So the first thing that I wanted to start with is really, I want us to kind of ground ourselves in the anti-war situation broadly. And so the first question I have for the group is, how is the United States supporting genocide in Palestine and in the broader region? And I'm going to pass it to Skyler to answer that one.
Yeah, I appreciate that this is the first question because it's a really good point for clarifying why we organize in the anti-war movement. Overall, the United States has a long history of sending money to Israel and funding its military at pretty much all levels of U.S. government and institutions. So the Minnesota Anti-War Committee has been mainly focused on the Minnesota State Board of Investment, or the SBI for short, which is a board chaired by Governor Tim Walz, who people might recognize from Kamala's campaign, I don't know, which manages the state's investments for state retirement plans like mine as a clerical worker at the University of Minnesota. Naturally, Apartheid Walz, as we like to call him, has made sure my state pension is drenched in blood through investments in Israel, which makes me absolutely sick. That said, U.S. support for genocide and violence carried out by Israel goes far and wide beyond just my state of Minnesota. So before October 7th, 2023, the federal government annually awarded Israel with around $3 billion as adjusted for inflation in military and economic aid. For example, Israel received $3.31 billion in 2021 and $3.18 in 2022. Overall, U.S. military and economic aid to Israel before October 7th amounted to as much as $260 billion in today's dollars as adjusted for inflation. But as soon as the ongoing genocide of Gaza began in 2023, those numbers really spiked. So between October 8th, 2023 and June 27th of last year, which is a span of only 9 months, the U.S. supplied Israel with $6.5 billion in military assistance, or a reported average of $25 million a day. A little over 3 months later, on October 7th, only 3 months later, the numbers had skyrocketed to $17.9 billion. As adjusted for inflation in military aid alone, as reported by Brown University's Watson Institute. This includes military financing, weapons sales, and transfers from U.S. weapons stockpiles, In other words, US bombs were being dropped on Gazans and US tax dollars were funding all the other weapons being dropped. There was an additional $4.86 billion provided to Israel by that time to support Israel's bombing of the brave Yemeni people as they stood up against the genocide, which brings the total to $22.76 billion in military aid in the first year of the genocide alone. And this was just what happened under Biden. So now Trump is taking over supporting the genocide. And one example of what he's done is on March 1st, the Trump administration approved $12 billion in major foreign military sales to Israel. And the money just it just keeps flowing. And so what about state investments like here in Minnesota, just as an example? So as of December 2024, the Minnesota Anti-War Committee has identified about $5.4 billion invested in entities either directly or indirectly complicit in the genocide in Gaza. This includes $12 billion in Israeli bonds, directly funding the state of Israel, $103 million in Israeli corporations actively sustaining the failing Israeli economy, $586 million in non-Israeli weapons manufacturers actively selling in Israel, and $3.9 billion invested in companies that profit off of the occupation and genocide indirectly. You can learn more about these numbers in our DivestMN campaign at divestmn.com. One of the main Israeli companies we like to focus on is Elbit Systems, which is the Israeli military technology and defense contractor responsible for surveillance technology along the US-Mexico border wall and the Israeli apartheid wall. The Minnesota SBI has $1.4 million invested in Elbit Systems. This is all just examples from one state, not even including municipal investments by cities in Minnesota or investments by the colleges and universities in Minnesota, in particular the University of Minnesota, which we know has a lot of money, but they don't really like to tell you how much money they have invested, but we know there's a lot. There is clearly a significant amount of money being invested in Israel by state, financial, and institutional powers in this country that are actively funding Israel. So what exactly have they been using that money for? Well, war and genocide, obviously. In the first 200 days of the genocide following October 7th, Israel had dropped an estimated 70,000 tons of explosives on Gaza. Decades of U.S. investment in Israel have led to Tel Aviv becoming one of the leading cities in technological development. So that, no doubt, has led to the advanced technological machines of war, such as the use of artificial intelligence to target and bomb Palestinian civilians in Gaza. U.S. support for Israel has also built up its ability to export its violence through arms sales, coups, and wars abroad, operating alongside U.S. interests. There's the historic example of Israeli aid to apartheid Africa, such as their infamous and failed attempt alongside the CIA to invade Angola to end their struggle for national self-determination. They have a lot of money, but they're still losers. Today, US-funded efforts to oppose democracy and self-determination in the Middle East and Africa continue, namely through increasing the political, economic, and military presence of the US and Israel in Muslim-majority countries through normalizing relations with Israel. Of course, when these countries are majority pro-Palestine, normalizing relations usually goes hand in hand with military dictatorships. One pressing example is the US and Israel's interest in the ongoing civil war in Sudan. The Red Sea is a major commercial shipping route for Israeli goods, and a blockade of those goods would have a huge impact on both Israeli and US economies. This is, of course, why the US aided and funded the bombing of Yemen. And it's also why they have an interest in determining what happens in Sudan because of their coast along the Red Sea. The US and Israel have played both sides through the conflict to ensure whoever wins normalizes relations with Israel. This also means helping to put down any effort for democracy in, again, the pro-Palestine majority country. This is consistent with the ways the US has always used Israel as its base of operations of imperialist domination and control throughout Africa and the Middle East to control their economies, land, resources, and politicians to serve US moneyed interests. Now this month, we see continued escalation of US imperialist and, by extension, Israeli aggression against Iran. Bombing campaigns by the US and Israel killed over 600 people and wounded nearly 5,000 as bombs fell largely into civilian areas in Tehran, a city of about 9 million people. Mass destruction and death is the policy of the United States and, by extension, Israel. But we continue to see the rest of the world standing up for their self-determination and not backing down to US-funded genocidal violence. So why am I going into this at the beginning of a webinar that's mainly about the LGBTQ movement? Well, because our community, the LGBTQ community, is a major part of the movement against US-funded violence, both in the United States and abroad. Pinkwashing obviously will be touched on later, but it's important to state that while the US and Israel tell us that these enemy countries mistreat our community, we stand with those countries to say that no queer or trans person, no woman or child is liberated by bombs falling on their homes. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think that Skyler, you got at one of the, obviously you touched on a lot. I think that all of us are pretty well versed at this point in like the atrocities that are happening in Gaza and are happening more broadly throughout the entire Middle East and North Africa. But just like you said, pinkwashing plays a very significant role in the attitude towards the Zionist occupation in the United States. You know, a lot of us here are queer, and our queerness is weaponized against ourselves, really, as queer pro-Palestinian organizers and as queer anti-war organizers to justify the atrocities that we're seeing. And so our next question is going to be, what really is pinkwashing, and how is it used in the US, and how do we fight it? And first, I'm going to ask Lana to speak about that.
Hello, everyone. So what is pinkwashing? In the most general terms, it is just performative sympathy toward queer communities to further an agenda. However, in the context of Israel, it is strongly entangled with a concept called homonationalism. And basically, homonationalism is the process of how the most privileged gays in Western country are assimilated into existing power structures and Western family norms. So you're white, cisgender, middle class gays with Western religious views, ideally apolitical at home, nationalist abroad, and consumerist. And this came about in the United States because of the Stonewall insurrection. And they wanted to make that quiet down, so they co-opted the most acceptable gays and divided the rest. Homonationalism was coined by Jasbir K. Buar in the context of how treatment of queer people in Afghanistan and Iraq was used to justify the US occupations in both those countries. And the first identified example of it was during the 1979 Iranian Revolution, where the treatment of gay people was used to manufacture opposition to the new government. And just to show you how fast co-optation happened, that was 6 years after homosexuality was delisted from the DSM as a mental illness. So basically, it's why Tammy Baldwin is Ride or Die for Israel, and obviously it's very Eurocentric. It's based in this very old concept that Western culture is superior and must be evangelized. And it's basically a racist playbook for colonialism and imperialism used to reinforce Western structures of family and property. Ironically, it was used to destroy indigenous queer community identities. But anyways, in order to combat pinkwashing and homonationalism, you must recognize queer identity is unique to every culture, and it's their struggle to lead. So moving on to identifying and refuting pinkwashing, you have to ask 3 questions about any argument that comes up. Does it criticize the outsider while ignoring domestic homophobia and transphobia? Is the party giving the argument paying lip service to the LGBT community without doing anything for our community? And does the track record of the party contradict its words? In other words, you got to find the receipts and use your critical thinking skills. So some examples of pinkwashing to run through, starting with Europe and the United States and moving on to Israeli examples. The far-right French parties want to protect gays from Muslim and immigrants. However, the reality is they voted against same-sex marriage 10 years ago. Democrats are the protectors of the LGBTQ community, and you should vote for them or else. They actually do very little to provide federal protections when they are in office. LGBTQ birthright Israel trips from North American show Israel is progressive on gay rights. In reality, Israel does not provide same-sex marriages. It sometimes recognizes foreign marriages, but engages in social benefit discrimination. And the whole point of these queer birthright trips is literally to send queer Jews back to the United States and Canada to say how great Israel is. Israel is a safe haven in West Asia for gays. Israeli culture is still very homophobic under the surface. Members of the government are still very openly gay. I mean, very openly homophobic. And being queer continues to not fit neatly with the ethno-nationalist ideals of Israeli society, which is to be big macho men and fertile women. Okay, and then similar, Israel is a safe haven for Palestinian gays. Israel wants its Palestinian gays cleansed of their culture and isolated from the rest of their people. There is a strong expectation to become fluent in Hebrew and convert to Judaism. And their ability to stay in Israeli territory is usually precarious, and they never ever receive full acceptance. And to end it off, a personal interaction in the wild while doing a banner drop. You would be killed in Palestine. Well, Sarah Schulman's LGBT delegation to Palestine all survived and only faced danger from the IDF. And to bring it back around to ignoring issues in the ignoring domestic issues, white Christian nationalists want to outlaw my identity at best and want to kill me at worst. That is all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Lana. I actually wanted to ask Sara if you could expand on that as well. So again, we're talking about what is pinkwashing, how is it used in the US, and how do we fight it? And I think that you can also lend a lot to that conversation. So I'm going to pass it off to you.
Thanks, Ryan, and thank you, Lana, for that thorough analysis and explanation behind pinkwashing. I'm going to speak a little bit more towards the process in which we see pinkwashing utilized to advance imperialist interests. So, like Lana was saying, right, pinkwashing is a tool used to manufacture consent for imperialist intervention in the region. It's not because any government or any imperialist government, specifically like the US or any other, have it in their heart to advance the rights of women and LGBTQIA people. It's purely for their own interests to manufacture consent for covert and overt forms of intervention. So more often than not, they're hiding behind claims of repressive governments to advance those goals. We've seen it throughout the Arab and Muslim world, like we saw in Libya and Afghanistan, even more recently in Syria, where every single time US intervention succeeds in an area, one of the tools they employ is pinkwashing, and what happens next is always much worse for the people of the region. And part of pinkwashing fundamentally relies on Islamophobic and xenophobic tropes, right? So we saw this for the last few decades, but especially since 2001, consent has been regularly manufactured for imperialist intervention in the Middle East by falling on these tropes of like the backwards Arabs, the backwards Muslims, right? Somehow our people are more inherently homophobic or oppressive of women and marginalized genders, while, like Lana said, we've been watching a rollback on every single right that people's movements have won for our communities over the last several decades. And we see, you know, the forces that utilize pinkwashing, again, more often than not, they expose their true nature once applied with any type of pressure from people's movements. To speak to like a more local example of this, the Cummer Museum is an institution that receives exorbitant amounts of funding, right? And every year for Pride, they would put together some kind of Pride event. And I believe in 2024, there's a local organization, Duval Folks, that puts together queer dance parties, specifically catering to Black and Brown queer communities. So they reached out to the Jacksonville Palestine Solidarity Network to partner at their queer dance party for Pride. That was originally going to be hosted at the Cummer Museum. And once the Cummer Museum saw that Jacksonville Palestine Solidarity Network was a part of it, they immediately removed support and actually told Duval Folks that they could not have the event at the Cummer Museum unless we were removed from the programming, right? And unless Palestine was removed from the programming. And this happens all the time with corporations, governments, NGOs, who advance like pinkwashing as a tool or as a propaganda tool to manufacture consent. Like I said earlier, we see it even now with the current Trump administration targeting DEI and different social services and programs, and every single corporation that changed its logo every Pride Month to keeping them the same, right? They have no material interest in advancing our rights as queer people, as women, but they have all the material interest in hiding behind false claims of oppression or claims of oppressive regimes or governments as like the primary contradiction for why a region or why a country isn't advancing socially, economically, when we know it's the presence of US imperialism that makes that the reality for our communities.
Absolutely. And I actually wanted to ask you another question. So we've been talking a lot about how pinkwashing in the US is fundamentally the way in which imperialism interacts with queer people here in the United States. But I think we'd be remiss not to talk about how imperialism interacts with queer people in Palestine, in Gaza, in these oppressed nations. And I wanted to ask you if you could speak to how the liberation of queer people and women in Palestine relates to the Palestinian liberation movement as a whole.
I almost want to be a little bit silly and be like, it can stop at the fact that I am both a Palestinian queer person and we exist and we have a right to self-determination in our national struggle. But I'm not going to be silly today. So to give like a little bit of context to like I guess women's struggle and queer struggle in Palestine. Palestinian society pre-Zionist colonization was sustained by an agricultural and pastoral economy, and the roots of patriarchal society that continues on today can be directly traced back to that. The majority of our society was fellahin or peasantry, similar to other societies characterized by semi-feudal relations to means of production. This meant that the majority of Palestinian families were then structured in a patriarchal manner. The men worked the land and the women maintained the home. This started to shift once British occupation and Zionist colonization began to reach the shores of Palestine. We saw it first with the general strike of 1936, which was one of the longest strikes in history, where Palestinian women took up not only supportive roles of like providing food to strikers and clothing and any like medical care they needed, but also actually taking up arms and like combating with like taking up armed combat against British occupation soldiers. This continued from 36 and developed onward through Al-Nakba, the catastrophe in 1948. But another like heightened moment where we saw this developed was during Al-Nakba, the setback in 1967. Around this time and shortly after, every single Palestinian political party and faction had formed some form of women's committees, often under the guise of like homemaking and providing support for women for that purpose. But in the reality, these communities were engaging in political struggle by advancing the political education of Palestinian women and children in refugee camps around the region, as well as like the political training, right? So teaching Palestinian women how to use a gun, how to ration for times of Zionist siege. And again, like as history continues to develop, we saw during the first Palestinian Intifada, something that was often named was not like Intifada means shaking off, right? So it wasn't only a shaking off of the Zionist occupation and the oppression that results from it, but it was also a shaking off of gender oppression, where Palestinian women were once again propelled to the forefront of a national struggle. This led to various like Palestinian women who've led our national struggle, adequately noting that while our primary confrontation is and always will be against Zionism and imperialism until our lands and people are liberated, that we can't ignore the struggle and the need to struggle against oppression based on gender and sexuality, that we can take up both struggles at the same time while we keep a maintained lens of the primary contradiction in our national struggle. One of like the other ways we see this now of like the role that Palestinian women play in our national liberation and how the liberation of Palestinian women and Palestinian people in general are intrinsically tied is through the prisoners' committees. So a relic of the British occupation is administrative detention, where they're able to detain Palestinians with no charge, no trial, for indefinite periods of 6 months that can be renewed indefinitely. And we see like there's two sides to this, right? One being the support Palestinian women play in upholding the prisoner committees. So they're getting legal support, they're providing aid to the families while their loved ones are imprisoned. They're organizing political actions and campaigns to demand their release. But we're also on like the side of the Zionist occupation, the tactics they use against queer Palestinians and women is, essentially trying to turn queer Palestinians into informants by fear-mongering us, saying that if we don't, report on whatever information they're looking for, and the Palestinian Authority upholds this as well in collaboration with the Zionist occupation, but that they'll, out them to their loved ones and family members. So that's another reason why it's the struggle for liberation of Palestinians must include the liberation of Palestinian women and queer folks, because we're being utilized, or the Zionist occupation is attempting to utilize us as tools for the occupation. And that's why quite a large amount of Palestinian queers will go into administrative detention for refusing those attempts to make us informants against our own people. And to close, I kind of want to quote a poem that I think speaks to this, and I'm not going to read the full poem, but just a part of it. It's by Fedwa Tuqan, who is known as like one of the voices of the Palestinian Revolution, one of the poets of Palestine. And she wrote Hamza, I believe, in the 1950s. I couldn't find the exact published date, but she in the poem, she's speaking about the occupation of Palestine, and she intentionally relates it to the oppression of women. And I'll read the lines, but my sister, our land has a throbbing heart. And it's interesting because she has, the person speaking in the poem is actually a man, because it offered more legitimacy than a woman speaking to make this comparison at the time. But my sister, our land has a throbbing heart. It doesn't cease to beat, and it endures the unendurable. It keeps the secrets of hills and wombs. This land sprouting with spikes and palms is also the land that gives birth to a freedom fighter. This land, my sister, is a woman. And when Fadwa Tuqan talks about like why she wrote this poem and why she related the national oppression, our national struggle, to the oppression of women in Palestine, was because they were inseparable, right? Like this is part of the Palestinian people. There is no liberation for our people unless we're free from Zionist colonization and imperialism, but also free from any societal oppression that keeps us under. So, yeah.
So much, Sara. And I think it's so important for us to remember, really like what you were fundamentally saying is that there is a women's liberation movement. There is a queer liberation movement in Palestine that has shown advances, that has been a part of the national liberation movement. Um, and when we get to the heart of pinkwashing, it's fundamentally that the advancement of queer rights, of women's rights, for whether it's for us here in the United States or whether it's for Palestinians living under occupation, the advancement of their well-being is not hiding in uh, the payload of a bomb that's being dropped on Gaza right now. And so we have to do everything that we can to fight against it. And we also have to do everything we can to fight against the reactionary movement that is growing here in the United States, especially under Trump. We have seen, obviously, Zionism present itself under the Democrats. We will never give any leeway to the Biden administration for facilitating this genocide, but we have also seen the Trump administration go full speed ahead when it comes to advancing genocide in Palestine and advancing broader war in the region, and unquestionably supporting every action of the Zionist entity. And so I wanted to actually ask Skyler to speak about the importance of the queer movement to the broader Trump resistance movement. And so Skyler, I'll pass it to you.
Thanks. Yeah, what I love about this question is that you could ask it about pretty much any movement and why it's important to the broader Trump resistance movement, and the answer is basically the same every time. Like, what is the importance of the women's and reproductive rights movement to Trump resistance? The movement for Black lives and community control of the police, immigrant rights movement, labor, students, anti-war, climate justice. Whatever the movement, we organize to mobilize people around demands to build a better world, and that means fighting billionaire far-right interests like Trump's. It means building coalitions and marching in the streets together. So just last week, the Trump administration supported the disgusting decision by the Supreme Court upholding a Tennessee law banning gender-affirming care for transgender youth, a decision with severe ramifications for our community and for the lives of the youths seeking care. This is following decades of similar attacks and is part of a mounting anti-trans movement by far-right forces. According to the trans legislation tracker, 116 anti-trans bills have been passed across the United States in 2025 alone. Compare this to 51 bills passed in 2024, 87 in 2023, 26 in 2022, and 18 in 2021. We can see a growing anti-trans movement among right-wing politicians. So where are our supposed saviors, the Democrats? Well, for the last 4 years, the Democrats were busy bankrolling wars and funding genocide, when they didn't even bother having their usual sellout queer or trans speaker at the Democratic National Convention. It sent a very clear message that the fight against anti-LGBTQ legislation and violence just isn't a priority for the Democrats. Supporting our community is a liability, apparently, but sending $22.76 billion in military aid to Israel to fund their act of genocide was defending peace and justice, okay? This is why our movements exist. We aren't going to sit around waiting on the whims of a party that serves the interests of billionaires to fight for us against the other party that also serves the interests of billionaires. I guess maybe sometimes the parties serve different billionaires, but then we all saw Target donated to both parties, so maybe not such different billionaires. So it's vitally important that if we want to protect our communities, if we want to see the movements for our communities grow and become strong enough to demand and win campaigns, we need to be organizing. And organizing means being organized. I'm always inspired when attacks like these happen and people spontaneously take to the streets and start demanding things. When George Floyd was murdered in my city, Black and working class youth fucking burned the police precinct down. And it's funny because the Democrats immediately were trying to put out these fires by trying to blame it on outside agitators and make people think that the police precinct, the pig pen, burning down was a bad thing or something that wasn't authentically part of our city's community. But it sure as hell was, and it was inspiring and ignited the entire country to protest. The problem is sustaining that kind of energy. I think if anyone has organized for more than 6 months. You see how energy starts to dip after these huge upsurges like that. Even the Palestine solidarity movement, while the genocide has been ongoing, has struggled with turning out the same numbers we were getting in the streets in fall of 2023. But if we weren't organized and we were just riding the waves of spontaneous protest, if we hadn't been working our asses off, putting actions together and building campaigns since October 7th, we wouldn't be prepared to fight the war with Iran or continued attacks by Israel. And that's the essence of organizing. It's harnessing the energy of people who are angry, plugging them into a movement and building a sustained campaign so you're ready for the next big upsurge. But our movements also don't exist in a vacuum. And frankly, there is no anti-war or Palestine solidarity movement without a movement for, just as one example, Black lives and the struggle for community control of the police. That's especially true in Minneapolis, where yes, we've had a committed activist scene for decades and decades, but without the uprising, none of our movements in the Twin Cities would be where they are right now. So many people hit the streets and saw with their own eyes what was like for the police to throw tear gas at them for marching peacefully. People saw for themselves what injustice looked like, and there's no way that didn't inform people when they saw bombs falling on Gaza. Our movements are intimately tied because they inform each other and because their enemies are the same. It's the same billionaires and politicians and war criminals. Trump is attacking our trans community while he escalates a war with Iran and gives money to Israel, while also launching a war at home against the immigrant community, while pushing for more coal production to poison our air, while attacking access to abortion, and so on and so on. So this is just to say, if we want to win, if we want to build any movement, be it the anti-war movement, the LGBTQ movement, or anything, we need to be working together. Something that's been happening here in the Twin Cities was initiated by the Climate Justice Committee and Minnesota Abortion Action Committee in response to 5051 and other newer forces in the anti-Trump movement. People were trying to bring those forces closer to find ways to work with them and find ways that we can collaborate and reach each other's people. That's especially important because so many of the people we're seeing protesting Trump right now are people who haven't necessarily been going to protests regularly for the last few decades. I think it's really easy to write people off for that. But the coalition was formed, but the People's Action Coalition Against Trump, it not only endorsed the St. Paul principles, which are used to operate generally, it endorsed a pro-Palestine position, which is huge. And that's a really big deal for bringing so many new people closer to our movement. Like, sure, they weren't marching before, but now they might be. The LGBTQ movement is another one of our movements that we need to build in this period if we want any chance of fighting not just Trump's attacks against the LGBTQ community, but also if we want any hope at fighting his genocide and wars. In my city, that's largely taken shape in the Taking Back Pride Coalition, which was formed to interrupt the annual corporate pride march and demand cops and corporations out. It's really incredible to see so many queer and trans organizers and activists coming together to bring the LGBTQ movement back. We've seen the anniversary of Stonewall turned into a highly marketable parade surrounded by cops and full of corporate floats. And we're bringing back marching with righteous anger and boots on the ground. And people are carrying the lessons from Taking Back Pride back into their respective activist groups, or they're joining new groups, maybe even forming new groups. Queer and trans people honestly take up so much of the membership of the Minnesota Anti-War Committee, along with so many of the other groups we organize alongside, that if we didn't have that, there just wouldn't be a path forward for any of our movements. I think if your city doesn't have an organized LGBTQ movement, even a coalitionary effort like in mine, it's something that's needed. I think our community is one that clearly sees how it's being treated and has a significant amount of energy if moved in the right direction. There's a slogan that I think is well-meaning, but ultimately problematic, which is "Our existence is resistance." I know it resonates with so many people in our community as we struggle to be ourselves under a world controlled by billionaires and politicians who hate us. But to build a movement, we need to look around and see the bigger picture. I think it's very individualistic and defeatist. I know it's our existence, but it feels framed around individuals living as themselves, and that's kind of it. It's as if to say, by living and existing as myself, I'm doing the only thing that I can do, and to fight back against attacks on me. like I'm doing me and that's powerful, except it seems to say that living our lives is also it's all we can do or all we need to do. The trans and queer people throwing bricks at Stonewall had already been living as themselves. That's exactly why they were at Stonewall. That's what they were there to do. But a time still came when they needed to throw some fucking bricks at cops. I think we need to reframe our movement back to being a movement of solidarity and mutually struggling together to protect all of us by fighting for a world where we all can freely be ourselves. We need to reframe things as resistance for our existence. We're not going away. We're not backing down. We're here. We're queer. And we're ready to organize and fight. I think that requires action and hitting the streets and joining and building movements, particularly now against Trump. Together with the strong movement, I don't think Trump stands a goddamn chance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Skyler. I think that you got at something really important, which is how we build in this moment while we're fighting against Trump and while we're trying to enmesh ourselves in the broader Trump resistance movement. Anti-War Action Network is not an organization that exists just to make statements or as like some sort of social club. It is an action network, right? And so one of the things that I think is extremely important for us to take away from this panel is strategies and tactics in how to advance the fight, how to go out in your locality, whether you're already in an organization that is part of Anti-War Network or not, to advance the struggle for Palestine where you are. And so I'm actually going to have Elle speak about that. So Elle, I wanted to ask, how can we build for Palestine in queer spaces like Pride festivals?
Yeah, so I'd like to start this section off by first saying that I'm glad I was able to go and answer this after Skyler because they have covered a lot of sort of built good groundwork onto what I'd like to talk about. Because like we're having this talk today because we all recognize that like right now there are countless extreme attacks against all of our communities. There's crackdowns on queer health access, deportations, there's genocide, there's war. And we recognize that these are not separate and unrelated attacks, right? These are part of the structure of US imperialism that places some individuals at the top and our communities at the bottom. And the ways our communities are being attacked are different, and that's really important to recognize. But it's also really important to recognize that the only way out of this, like the only way that we can win, is to unite with all of these oppressed communities that are facing violence at the hands of the same entity, and to fight back. So to start with Pride festivals, as many people are already aware, a lot of them are corporate now, and they are sponsored by war. We've all seen the Rainbow Lockheed Martin employees, Boeing. There's police that march in parades. A lot of these pride parades are about corporate interests over liberation. And these corporate interests are the ones that serve imperialism, oppression, and genocide, and they have no space in our movements. So what we need to do is we need to start encouraging people to both boycott these events, and also like fight back against them. And you can fight back at these events by protesting or flyering, which hopefully will expose this hypocrisy and raise the political consciousness of the people at these pride parades, hopefully bring more people into the liberation movements, because Pride started out as a riot, right? These corporate sponsored pride events are like antithetical to the entire concept of liberation and our history. And exposing that is a really, really important step in truly uniting our communities to fight against our oppressors, because like this is something I'm sure a lot of you have heard many times, but I will say it over and over again. None of us can be free until we're all free, right? So another important way that you can, take back pride from these corporate sponsored pride festivals, is to organize your own people's pride events. So if we're to come together to like fight a common enemy, we actually need to have spaces that are actively against all forms of oppression. Especially because like most people don't experience just one form of oppression, right? Like many people live at the intersections of these oppressive systems and they face multiple manifestations of imperialist violence. So we really need to be diligent in creating and maintaining spaces that are actively conducive to our joint liberation. A community-built event like a People's Pride not only creates these spaces, but also helps create the unity and the coalition of community that's needed to strengthen all of our causes. But building for Palestine in queer spaces should not just be something that is limited to 1 month out of the year. It's not just a Pride Month thing. So I'd like to bring in some personal experience that I have experienced organizing in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. We've done a lot of things that have been extremely helpful in building up coalition. One of the things that we do often is tabling in queer spaces. We've actually brought in a lot of donations to the anti-war movement by showing up every week to table at a local drag club. We've even been able to give speeches about Palestine and about our work in between performances. And in doing so, we've made a lot of really close relationships with other queer organizers, which continues to help us tie our movements together. We've been able to make ties with a queer art collective out here, whose members have been so supportive in so many ways. And having a close relationship with artists has been really helpful in terms of actually making big statements at protests. They were able to help us make these really beautiful giant Palestinian sunbirds that we have used at a couple rallies. You may have seen them if you've seen pictures of rallies in Dallas. They're huge, they're beautiful. Art is actually a perfect medium for this kinds of collaboration. And like another example of ways that we've used this kind of a coalition is an event called Punks for Palestine, which I know is not exclusive to Dallas. I believe California has also done Punks for Palestine. It's a really cool event. Local musicians, punk musicians come and play, artists come and table, organizations table, and all the proceeds go to various Palestinian causes. So like people are selling food and art in exchange for like eSIMs and donations to various organizations like the Middle East Children's Alliance, or specifically to families that they know in Gaza who need donations. And being that it's the punk scene, it's very queer, it's very inclusive, and it's a really good way to kind of bring community together. So there's like a lot of room for organizing these joint queer and anti-war events, but there's also a lot of opportunities to politicize like non-political spaces or like more casual queer spaces. We've done a lot of flyering just in our local neighborhood and in like city downtowns. Flyering is huge in terms of getting the word out and educating people. And we've brought in a lot of people who've just seen our flyers at coffee shops or talked to us because we were hanging out, you know, tabling on the street, and they saw what we were about and they wanted to join the movement. And that's been extremely cool to see. So I guess to sum up, like when we talk about building for Palestine and queer spaces, there's also this really important aspect as well that we need to talk about, where we need to be showing up as openly queer in Palestinian spaces as well, right? Because we're not going into these spaces, first of all, to make things about ourselves. Showing up queer in these spaces, we're doing so because we are queer people who are willing to show up for Palestinian liberation, right? It's a mutually beneficial relationship. It's mutual solidarity. It's, I will stand with you, and I hope that you will stand together with me. We see keffiyehs at the pride parades, more of that. It's really great to see. And true liberation really cannot exist, right, until we tear down this imperialist, this system. And in that way, like the relationship between Palestinian liberation and queer liberation is intrinsic, just like all forms of liberation. So while we're doing really important work from different angles, it's a lot more beneficial if we coordinate our attacks. It gives us so much more power to fight against US imperialism and all of its manifestations if we do this. We need to be able to strike back at this system that is holding both Palestinians and queer folk back. And to finish, I guess I'd like to just reiterate something I said earlier. It's really, it's that none of us can be free until we're all free. Like, we need to be doing everything we can to unite our communities, to build together against US imperialism so that we can achieve collective liberation. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So, Elle, that was fantastic. I love ending on an action-oriented note. We're now going to move into a question and answer section. And so the first question I see here from Maya is following the recent attacks on Iran, there's been a lot of online discourse about human rights for Iranian women. I think Lana and Sara spoke on this point a lot, but I feel like, why do these people suddenly care about war in the Middle East now? There's been a genocide in Palestine for a year and a half. What is this rooted in, and how can we work with people to begin to understand that something much greater is going on? And I will actually warm up this question a little bit. And anybody on the panel who would like to take this, raise your hand. But I actually wanted to speak quickly about a film screening that I and some other people from Jacksonville Palestine Solidarity Network attended. We weren't the organizers for it. It was something that was happening in a neighboring city where they were trying to kind of curry the attention of surfers, right? There's this film called Gaza Surf Club that we watched. And one of the main problems with that film was that it engaged in pinkwashing to a certain extent, where this film about Palestinians in Gaza who have no access to buy surfboards, that don't have access to fish enough to actually like sustain themselves, that have all of these problems, that are constantly under bombardment. It chose to put so much emphasis on this woman that the film portrayed as unable to surf because of hijab. And one of the things I was so grateful of is that we had some older Muslim women in the audience who are hijabi, and who pointed out, you know, that they've worn hijab their whole lives and they've been able to swim just fine, right? That one of them talked about the fact that her ex-husband, who she divorced for this reason, forced her not to wear hijab. Because he was worried about how it looked in the West. And she divorced him so that she could wear hijab again, right? I think when we talk about Iran, there is so much of this emphasis on the Muslim tradition of hijab, and I even made this point at that film screening because there were some people who thought that we were raising this concern and that it was like so innocuous. But we made the point of, you know, there's a war going on in Iran. Iran is being bombarded, and the first thing that media did was glamorize Tehran before the revolution. And how did they do it? By showing women in bikinis on the beach, right? So it's not such an innocuous thing. They know what they're doing. And I think that it speaks to the heart of how pinkwashing works, and why pinkwashing is looked at as this tool to, like Sara said, to manufacture consent for imperialism. So I'm going to leave it there, and I'll open it to anybody else on the panel who'd like to speak to this question. All right. I guess okay, Sara, you'd like to speak to it?
Yeah, I can just add a little bit more. I think you killed it, Pookie, but I think like to the question of like where, if y'all hear a kitten in the background, I'm so sorry. But like what is this rooted in, and how can we work with people to begin to understand that something much greater is going on? Like this is more so just a reminder that ideas don't drop out of the sky, right? Like it's intentional that people have been propagandized to think this way and believe this way, right? That like somehow the US government is the greatest defender of human rights around the globe, which we know isn't true. We watch it here with domestic policy alone. We know that people are one paycheck away from being homeless and being evicted by the same killer cops who like murder their loved ones on the street, right? So I think like the greatest lessons and like camaraderie is built through struggle. So I think some folks mentioned in the chat and like even on the panel about the different types of events they've been able to do to like make it clear and also humanize like Arabs and Muslims and queer Arabs and Muslims, right? Because we're treated as like these anomalies, as like these non-existing forces. And I also just want to encourage folks like in terms of resources that speak to this directly, more so in the case of Palestine. But there's Alqaws is ALQAWS. It's an organization of queer Palestinians. And they released like an article last year, I believe. I have it pulled up now, but reflecting on queerness in times of genocide, right? And they explicitly name kind of like the what homo nationalism, what pinkwashing does in these moments, like Lana laid out. How we're seeing Israeli soldiers literally place like rainbow Israeli flags in the ruins of Gaza, right? Um, like, and the same people who are now clamoring about rights for Iranian women are the same people who turned a blind eye to that. They turn a blind eye to Palestinian women being forced to give C-sections with no anesthesia. They turn a blind eye to Palestinian women being prevented from, and Palestinian people in general, not receiving like menstrual and reproductive care and access right now during the course of the genocide. So it's rooted in like the decades of propaganda that have been utilized to manufacture consent. And that's why we have like a very important role of like reaching out to our communities, holding political education events that dispel all the myths that have been like forced upon us.
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Sara. And I hope that that answers your question, Maya. The next question that we have here is from Meredith, a fellow steering committee member for A1, who's asking specifically Skyler to talk about what you guys do in Minneapolis to prepare for Pride, things you do like training or tabling training, prepping folks to not make assumptions about pronouns and their gender roles. And in those trainings, role-playing Zionist gay men being assholes. So if you would like to speak to that, Skyler, go ahead.
Yeah. I better not get anything wrong or forget anything, or else I'm going to hear about it. But I'll just say, you know, we are like one of the main groups that are involved with Taking Back Pride. But at the same time, we still do table at corporate Pride. This year, we're actually tabling at both corporate Pride and there's a People's Pride that's been going on for a few years. And so we have enough members at this point that we're tabling at both, which is really exciting because we can, you know, come into contact with so many people. And a lot of the reasons, just to like go over why before I go into how, I guess, a lot of the reasons that we've been tabling at corporate Pride for so many years is that it is probably the opportunity to meet the most just everyday people. The fact is that corporate Pride and the people who run corporate Pride are shitty. A lot of them aren't even gay, fully straight people. And if they are gay, again, they're shitty. We don't like them. But at the same time, everybody in the Twin Cities, for the most part, comes out to Twin Cities Pride, or at the very least, a lot of people. And if we didn't table there, we would be missing on a huge opportunity to meet people who really like us, actually. Last year, when we tabled, it was constant. And so, you know, we constant people coming up to us. I think I had maybe one person, and I did a lot of tabling last year. Maybe I had one person that was mildly upset with us, and they just went off on their own way. They just had like they'll just go by and you know they're Minnesotan, they're passive aggressive, and they don't actually want an altercation. So it's like not even anything you have to deal with. But it's so successful. I mean, we've gotten a lot of members out of it historically. And so a lot of how we prepare for it, I mean, at this point, it's down to kind of a science, right? You know, we have all of our materials. We do a lot of, I guess, let me think about what I'm actually being asked to talk about as far as training. It feels like it's kind of the prep. So we actually just, what was it, yesterday, had a whole training in our meeting about how to interact with people at the table, how to be respectful and things like that. Like Meredith said in the question, not making assumptions about people, especially their pronouns. Nobody is sirring or ma'aming. We didn't actually do a role play of any Zionist gay men this week because we had a very stacked meeting. But historically, we will do role plays. We have a whole sheet basically that we've worked on over the years that kind of gives the whole playthrough of how we kind of interact with people. The main thing that happens, just to like touch on the role plays with Zionist gay men, is that when people come to our table and they're being weird and they want to debate and they want to fight with us and they want to be like, you're supporting blah 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 blah, we just start chanting. You just start yelling free Palestine at somebody and they'll leave. Nobody wants to be chanted at individually, and just it's gonna stay there. And it's effective, and honestly it's great because it's like a building moment where it's like you're actually kind of facing off on someone on this issue and you're dealing with it and you're winning. And what else? I mean, we get a lot of materials for it. We actually have a zine committee that's made like 4 or 5 zines that go over a lot of different information. We have a zine about the apartheid. We have a zine about the Nakba. We have all these zines that can give people the information that they need when they stop by us, because it's about making, because there's so many people coming through that you can't necessarily have a quick conversation or a long conversation. You need to be ready to have the materials ready so you can get it to people as fast as possible and get them informed. Let them know about your next upcoming action. We actually are going to be having an action on Saturday. So we're going to be flying for it during Pride. And it's a little bit last minute, but we had to do it. It's an Iran emergency action. So it's just about like getting out as much information to people as we possibly can. I don't know if there's anything else people want to hear, but
That was great. You actually organically moved into one of the next questions, which is how are different organizations using propaganda and educational events to connect the queer struggle and the Palestinian liberation struggle? I will say in Jacksonville, we also have a pinkwashing zine. The gays love a good zine. I strongly recommend that you have some sort of pinkwashing material, paper material on your tables. Anti-War Action Network has a couple of different organizations in it that have pinkwashing materials. So if that's something that you're shy of, we're here as a network to help people to advance their ability to organize where they're at. And Seattle Against War said, are y'all Minneapolis folks willing to share those zines and practices? So definitely we'll have to talk after this about some sharing of our like print materials and stuff like that. I actually wanted to ask another question while we don't have any others in the queue. And I'm so sorry, Skyler, because you're probably going to be the one to answer this. You brought up the St. Paul principles while you were speaking earlier. And that is something that we're very familiar with here in Jacksonville. It's also something that we know were used at the March on DNC in Chicago, where we had, I'm pretty sure the biggest turnout in protest of a Democratic National Convention ever. So clearly powerful principles that are able to unite large forces together. And being from Minneapolis, St. Paul, I wanted to see if you could speak to those.
Sure. I will say it's very funny. It took me years of knowing about the St. Paul principles before I realized it was named after St. Paul, Minnesota. So the St. Paul principles came out of the 2008 Republican National Convention because there were so many groups in the cities that had different strategies about how to engage in protest, that had different plans they wanted to go into. One of the groups was the Anti-War Committee. And so the St. Paul principles were kind of an agreement that was come to in order so that people could be respectful of each other and operate in coalition. So I actually have a link here. Sorry to the people who are in watch parties and can't just open it on their computers. But this is actually put together by the Twin Cities Coalition for Jamar, or excuse me, Coalition for Justice, which is the NARPR affiliate in the Twin Cities. And so it lays it out really beautifully. We use this a lot for marshalling trainings, actually. And basically the gist of it is making sure that groups respect a diversity of tactics and plans of other groups. Basically, being able to operate in coalition. It's the big thing is a separation of time and space. So one thing that sometimes comes up, we always bring this up in martial trainings, right, is that maybe you're having a march, or maybe you're marshaling in a march, and the organizers of that march want it to be peaceful, because that's just their strategy for that day, or their tactic for that day, rather. And you might have people from another group who want to smash some windows. There's nothing inherently wrong with smashing windows, but that would be breaking the St. Paul principles, because the intention of the organizers for that action in that time and place is for it to be peaceful. So you'd have to be like, well, maybe you could do this at another time in the same place, or you could do it at the same time in a different place. So it's that separation of time and place. Debates and criticisms remain internal to the movement. So you wouldn't do a media denunciation of another activist group. That's really messed up, and that's not what we're about. That's not working in coalition. And then opposing any state repression of dissent, including surveillance, infiltration, disruption, and violence. We don't assist law enforcement. We don't tell on each other. That was especially needed, right, for something as big as a Republican National Convention, where a lot of things are happening. And again, people have different tactics, and a group might be predominantly or entirely peaceful. They might know about the tactics of another group. They might know about their plans. It would be horrible if they went and told the police about it because they don't agree with nonviolence, right? So the St. Paul principle gets people on the same page, make sure that we're all working together in a way that's respectful. And it also can, protect us in maintaining our work and making sure that our vision for our protests are carried out, regardless of other groups or individuals having a difference of opinion. And so getting groups like 5051, Women's March, and other members of the People's Action Coalition Against Trump packet, getting all those other groups signed onto the St. Paul principles is huge, because that makes sure that we're kind of all operating in the same rules. We're working together. We're being respectful. It's a really huge thing for our movement right now.
Thank you so much, Skyler. And actually, it's so funny. The first time I heard about the St. Paul principles was while I was JPSN is a NARPR affiliate. And the first time I heard about the St. Paul principles was I think in like early 2024, we were tabling somewhere. And this guy came up to me and he was like, have you guys heard of the St. Paul principles before? And I looked it up, and sure enough, I was like, oh, these were created by another NARPR affiliate. That's so cool. Jim Burns says, explain what NARPR is. So NARPR is the National Alliance Against Racism and Political Repression. I'm not sure if anybody else on the call would like to more elaborately go into what NARPR is or what their mission statement is. If not, that's okay. I think that NARPR, you can look at NARPR as in, Skyler, do you want to go again?
Sure. I mean, NARPR was an organization that was founded around the campaign to free, the name is I'm blanking.
Angela Davis.
Angela Davis. Thank you. It was to free Angela Davis, and then it was refounded a few years ago. And so it's a national organization fighting against repression and fighting for community control of the police.
Yeah. A great way to think about NARPR is what we are trying to do in the anti-war movement to create a broader, more intentionally connected anti-war movement between all of our organizations in the network. at a national level. NARPR is trying to do the same in fighting against political repression and against the crimes that the police wage against our people. So I believe we don't have any other questions. I'm going to give it a minute to see if anybody else has any questions that they'd like to ask. And then I'll have a few brief closing remarks. Okay. I wanted to say thank you so much to everybody who came, whether you are at a watch party or whether you're tuned in at home. I think that that this is an example of how the Anti-War Action Network is able to obviously everybody here who is a member of the Anti-War Action Network is part of an organization that is fighting like hell in their city, that is doing everything they can to push back against the United States' unwavering political and material support for a genocide, for imperialism broadly. And it is so valuable for us to have a network like this, where we can not just be taking the fight to our city, but sharing that fight with people all over the country and being better for it, sharing our tactics, having days of action and weeks of action where we know that when we are out there standing on a corner or standing in front of a port or whatever it is that we are doing, wherever it is that we are protesting, we are organizing, that we are trying to get more people activated, we know that we have people doing the same thing in countries or in cities all over the country. And that is one of the powerful things about the Anti-War Action Network. We are looking to grow as a network, and we are always looking for more fighters. And so if you are in an organization and your organization would like to be part of the Anti-War Action Network and you are not already, I would encourage you, or even if you just want more information about how you personally can get involved in the Anti-War Action Network, I would encourage you to reach out to us. You can contact us at antiwaractionnetwork@gmail.com. And if you're not following us on Instagram already, our Instagram is @Anti-War Action Network. And I'm going to paste that in the chat real quick for everybody. But once again, thank you guys so much. I hope to see everybody continuing to fight like hell. Because I truly believe that if we organize in a way that is smart and a way that is fierce, that we can have a lasting impact, that we can make real change, that we can fight back against this genocide and see a free Palestine in our lifetime. Thank you guys so much.